Berlin, April 1945. The city groaned under a gray sky that never seemed to move. Smoke hung like a ceiling over the ruins, drifting through broken windows and charred beams that once framed homes, cafes, and laughter. Somewhere between the echo of artillery and the silence that followed surrender, a young German woman named Liesel pressed her back against a wall still warm from the morning sun. In her trembling hands, she held a loaf of bread stale, cracked, but precious enough to protect with her life. Down the street, the sound of engines rolled closer. American trucks, the olive-drab kind the propaganda posters had promised were driven by monsters. The rumors had already filled every basement shelter and soup line. The Americans were coming. Some said they would take revenge for every bullet fired by a German rifle. Others said they came with chocolate and cigarettes. No one knew which version to believe. Liesel didn't either. She only knew that her brother was dead on the Eastern Front. Her father was gone to the rubble of Stalingrad, and her mother's cough grew worse each night. When she saw the first soldier, helmet tilted back, sleeves rolled up, a cigarette dangling from his mouth, he didn't look like the devil. He looked like a boy who hadn't slept. The truck stopped, gears grinding. Boots hit the cobblestones. Orders barked in English echoed between the burned walls. Children peeked from behind piles of bricks. One American soldier noticed them, smiled faintly, and pulled something from his pocket, a Hershey bar. The children stared like it was treasure. They'd been told that Americans were savages. Yet here he was, handing them chocolate wrapped in gold. The smallest boy hesitated, then took it. A ripple of laughter moved through the group. Small, nervous, disbelieving. But kindness in war is never simple. Behind the laughter, others watched with suspicion. An old man muttered that the enemy only fed you before he took something else. A woman in a torn coat whispered that it was better to starve than to owe them. Yet even she couldn't look away when another soldier unloaded crates labeled relief supplies. Flour, powdered milk, soap. The things Germans hadn't seen in months. The irony was almost unbearable. The army that had bombed their cities now brought them food. The uniform that had haunted their nightmares now stood between them and hunger. Nazi propaganda had once filled the air with venom. The Americans are mongrels, criminals, a plague on Europe. But when the leaflets stopped and reality walked in, it didn't match the lies. The soldiers were taller than expected, younger, too casual in their posture. They called out to each other with nicknames, joked in slang no one could understand. One of them, seeing Liesel struggle to lift a bucket of water, stepped forward without a word and helped her carry it. She flinched when his shadow fell over her face. He only nodded, tipped his helmet, and walked away. That night, Berlin smelled of smoke and soup for the first time in months. American field kitchens clattered in the open squares. The scent drew people like moths. They came quietly, holding out old tin bowls and ration cards with shaking hands. Soldiers ladled broth, sometimes adding a smile or a word they didn't know would be understood. The hunger softened everything. The anger, the pride, the fear. But it didn't erase it. For every act of mercy, there were whispers of cruelty somewhere else. For every chocolate bar given, there were stories of women taken in the dark. A German priest, walking through the ruins near Alexanderplatz, wrote in his diary that the war had burned away the thin layer of civilization that separated man from beast. Yet, he added, the Americans behave like men who are ashamed to win. They patrolled without the rage of conquerors, but they carried a power too great to hide. Each glance from them reminded the defeated who now ruled the ruins. Liesel's mother used to say that war changed a man's eyes before it changed his soul. She saw it now in the faces of these soldiers. Some looked with pity, others with curiosity. A few with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. She wondered what they saw when they looked at her. Enemy, woman, survivor, or simply another ghost wandering the rubble. The days grew longer. The checkpoints went up. Signs in English replaced swastikas. U.S. military government. Curfew, 2,100 hours. Life under new rules began with confusion and quiet humiliation. German men lined up for work permits issued by the same army they had once fought. Women swept the streets under the gaze of foreign patrols. Some soldiers whistled as they passed. Others looked away. And somewhere in the middle of that uneasy rhythm, a strange new relationship began to form between the conquerors and the conquered. The Americans were astonished by what they saw. Cities flattened, people broken, yet still dressing neatly, still saying, "Danke." They photographed everything. Smiling children, church ruins, women in headscarves pushing carts through dust. One photo, taken by a young GI from Ohio, showed two German girls washing clothes beside a destroyed tram. When he sent it home, he wrote, "They look like any girls back home, except the sky here never clears." In taverns that reopened under American supervision, jazz music replaced marching songs. The sound of Glenn Miller floated through the same air that once carried air raid sirens. First, no one dared to dance. Then one night, a soldier extended his hand to a German woman. She hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. It was an image the whole city would soon recognize. A defeated nation and its new protector, waltzing between ruins. Some called it hope. Others called it surrender. Still, not every story had light. Some women vanished from the refugee camps and were never seen again. Some soldiers couldn't tell mercy from power. Military police worked quietly to contain rumors, to separate fact from hysteria. Reports surfaced of black market exchanges, bread for favors, cigarettes for company. Each side pretended not to notice how easily survival blurred the line between morality and need. And yet, amidst that chaos, something purely human persisted. A nurse from Cologne later recalled an American medic tending to her wounded brother. When the boy died, the soldier took off his own dog tag and placed it in her palm, saying softly, "So he won't be forgotten." She kept it for the rest of her life. The ruins of Berlin became a stage for contradictions. Compassion and guilt shared the same street. The occupier became the rescuer. The once feared American uniform now appeared in children's drawings beside flowers and flags. But beneath every act of kindness lay the shadow of dominance, the quiet knowledge that power always demands a price. As the weeks passed, Liesel noticed the subtle change. Soldiers no longer looked like guests. They looked like owners. Their laughter filled the courtyards. Their radios played late into the night. Some neighbors grew comfortable, others resentful. The world had turned upside down. The victors of freedom were now the rulers of ruins and the women of Germany. Those who had survived bombs, hunger, and propaganda found themselves balancing between gratitude and shame. She stood one evening on a bridge, watching the sunset over the Spree River. Across the water, the American flag fluttered above a half-destroyed building. A soldier walked by, tipped his helmet again, and said in slow, careful German, "Good night." For the first time in years, she almost believed it could be. They came as liberators but stayed as something else. Berlin's ruins hid more than rubble. History remembers battles, not the quiet hands that trembled after. And in that twilight between war and peace, the greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was in the fragile, uneasy way strangers began to see each other as human again. The first months after Germany's surrender felt like walking through the ashes of a dream that refused to die. The war was over, but the peace was not yet born. In the streets of Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin, hunger ruled more fiercely than any army. Bread was rarer than gold, and every blackened window looked like an empty eye socket watching the victors move in. The Americans arrived with their trucks, their laughter, and their rules. Orders printed in English that no one could read but everyone feared to break. No fraternization, they said. No smiles, no handshakes, no contact with Germans. For many soldiers, that command lasted barely a week. They had fought through France, through snow and blood, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and now, standing in a broken city full of civilians who looked more like ghosts than enemies, the lines of right and wrong blurred. The soldiers were barely 20, and the women they met were barely older. The uniforms were clean, the hearts were not. In bombed-out apartments, families huddled around small stoves, burning anything that would catch. Chairs, picture frames, old letters. Every sound outside made women tense. They had seen what the Soviets had done in the East. They prayed the Americans would be different. Most of the time they were. But even the kindest face in a uniform could be terrifying when it carried the power to feed or starve you. One American lieutenant wrote home, "We were told to treat them like enemies, but they look at us like saviors. It's hard to tell what's worse." His unit set up a checkpoint near a refugee camp on the outskirts of Stuttgart. Each day, hundreds of women passed by carrying buckets, babies, and bundles of scrap cloth. They traded for food, soap, sugar, a handful of cigarettes. To the Americans, cigarettes were boredom. To the Germans, they were currency, survival, even seduction. The military command tried to stop it. Eisenhower issued circulars warning of moral collapse, of discipline breaking down. Yet everyone knew it was happening. War had torn open the moral seams of the world, and nothing stitched easily back together. The no fraternization rule collapsed under the sheer weight of hunger and loneliness. American soldiers were thousands of miles from home, haunted by the faces of the dead and the silence of victory. German women, abandoned by husbands or lovers who would never return, looked at these foreign boys not as conquerors but as a chance to feel human again, even for one night. In towns like Kassel and Nuremberg, the dance began quietly. A GI would slip a candy bar to a child, who would bring his sister to say thank you. She'd smile shyly, and soon there would be laughter, awkward German-English exchanges, secret walks after curfew. Not all were innocent. Some were tragic, some exploitative, some strangely tender. But all were part of a new kind of war, the war between memory and survival. One woman, Anneliese, wrote years later that she had hated herself for accepting a soldier's help. Her son was sick and the American medic brought penicillin. "He saved my child's life," she said. "But I never looked him in the eye, because I didn't want to owe him anything." Gratitude felt like surrender. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army tried to maintain an image of control. Chaplains lectured troops on purity and discipline. Posters warned of venereal disease and moral weakness. Yet, under the posters, soldiers passed folded notes written in shaky German. "Meet me near the river at 8. Commanders threatened court-martials. Few followed through. Reality was stronger than regulation. The black market grew like mold in the ruins. Silk stockings, perfume, chocolate. All the treasures of post-war life were traded for affection, favors, or companionship. The phrase fraternization offense became a joke whispered in the barracks. The soldiers called the women Fräuleins, half affection, half slur. The women called them Amos. Both sides knew what it meant, something between need and guilt. Yet not all relationships were transactional. In the rubble fields, groups of women known as Trümmerfrauen worked from dawn to dusk, clearing bricks by hand to rebuild their cities. Some Americans joined them uninvited. They shoveled alongside them wordlessly. One day in Munich, a soldier named Jack offered his canteen to a woman whose hands bled from lifting stone. She drank without looking at him. He said, "You shouldn't have to do this alone." She answered, "Neither should you." That moment, fleeting and fragile, captured what neither army nor propaganda could define. The meeting of two broken worlds trying to stand again. But for every Jack, there was another man who saw opportunity in chaos. There were reports, quiet, shameful ones, of assaults hidden by bureaucracy, of power used cruelly. For some, the uniform became a shield against accountability. The war had taught them that life was cheap. The peace didn't teach them otherwise soon enough. The U.S. military police investigated hundreds of cases, but records often vanished, replaced by phrases like disciplinary action taken or unsubstantiated claim. The truth was too complicated for headlines. Some soldiers protected women from violence. Others caused it. History, in its hunger for simplicity, would remember neither clearly. Among the German population, survival turned into strategy. Mothers taught daughters how to accept kindness without promises, how to smile without inviting, how to say no in English even when their stomachs said yes. Some fell in love genuinely. Others pretended until the food lasted. It was a currency everyone understood but no one spoke about. In late 1945, a German newspaper secretly printed an essay titled, "The New Morality." It argued that war has erased virtue not from our souls, but from our options. It was confiscated by the Allied censors, but its truth spread by word of mouth. What people called immorality was often just hunger wearing a human face. By the winter of 1946, fraternization was no longer a scandal, it was a fact of life. Thousands of unofficial relationships formed between American soldiers and German women. Some turned into marriages. Most ended in silence. The U.S. Army eventually changed policy, allowing certain unions to be recognized. But for every couple blessed by paperwork, 10 more were broken by orders to redeploy. Women waited at train stations with letters that would never be answered. In small apartments lit by candlelight, American soldiers wrote home to wives and girlfriends in Kansas, Chicago, or New York, pretending everything was fine. Then they'd step outside into the night air, the smell of wet stone and cigarettes, and wonder how one world could exist beside another. The guilt was heavy but distant. After all, wasn't this what victory was supposed to look like? Some soldiers tried to make amends in their own ways. They taught children baseball, shared spare rations, fixed roofs. One GI built a swing set for the orphans living near his post. Another helped a family find their missing son in a displaced persons camp. These small acts of decency rarely made the reports, but they mattered to those who saw them. As the occupation stretched on, the boundaries blurred further. Commanders realized they couldn't govern through prohibition. Instead, they began regulating. Medical stations offered checkups. Brothels reopened under supervision. Every compromise was wrapped in red tape and moral confusion. The army tried to sanitize human nature with paperwork. It didn't work. And through it all, the German women rebuilt their lives one brick at a time. They swept glass from streets, planted gardens in bomb craters, learned to live beneath foreign flags. For many, the Americans became part of the landscape. Sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, always powerful. Love stories and war crimes lived side by side in the same city blocks, separated only by luck. By the summer of 1946, the ruins began to bloom again. Markets reopened. Children played in courtyards once littered with shell casings. The sound of jazz floated from Allied radios, mixing with church bells that had somehow survived. The war was fading, but the cost of peace still echoed in every conversation. Every look, every uneasy smile shared across a language barrier. In that fragile balance of rebuilding and regret, one question lingered like smoke over every town. When love and loyalty meet the ruins of war, who is truly free, and who is merely surviving? By the spring of 1946, the ruins of Germany had begun to breathe again, but it was a shallow, uncertain breath. The Allied flags waved over city halls, schools reopened under foreign supervision, and ration lines stretched through streets that still smelled of dust and smoke. For the first time in years, silence no longer meant danger. Yet to many Germans, that silence was filled with another kind of unease, the sound of an unfamiliar order settling in. The Americans were no longer passing through. They were staying. What began as liberation had quietly turned into occupation, and with it came a new reality. The victors ruled not just with weapons, but with paperwork, ration stamps, and rules about everything from dance permits to marriage licenses. In the American zones, Bavaria, Hesse, and parts of Berlin, the U.S. Army became the law, the police, and even the post office. Trucks bearing white stars roared through boulevards where Hitler's parades once marched. The irony was sharp. The same streets that had celebrated a dictator now bowed to democracy delivered at gunpoint. German civilians learned new words: curfew, identification, clearance. And every week, more posters appeared offering jobs for translators, secretaries, cooks, and drivers. Thousands of German women found themselves working for the American military government, typing orders that controlled their own people's lives. Some wore uniforms with U.S. insignia on their sleeves, badges that meant access to food, power, and protection. Among the soldiers, the transformation was just as strange. They had trained to fight, not to govern. Now they signed requisitions, inspected schools, and drank coffee with mayors who had once served the Reich. Discipline softened. The fear that once held the army together faded in the comfort of victory. The no fraternization orders were officially lifted. What had been forbidden became tolerated and soon normal. By mid-1946, American commanders privately estimated that over half their troops were involved in relationships with German women. Newspapers called it the Second Invasion. But this one was made of affection, curiosity, and loneliness. Every soldier had a story. Private Richard Carson, from Texas, wrote home that he'd met a girl who could smile in 3 languages. They met in a bakery queue. He gave her his rations of sugar. She baked him a loaf of bread. Within weeks, they were inseparable. His letters described her laughter, the way she carried herself among ruins, and how she refused to call herself defeated. But for every story like Richard's, there were others that ended bitterly. Some soldiers promised marriage and never returned. Others tried to bring their German fiancés home, only to face rejection from their own families. "You're marrying the enemy," one mother wrote to her son. "We didn't raise you for that." Still, love persisted. Between 1946 and 1950, more than 14,000 German women would become war brides, approved by military authorities and shipped across the Atlantic on government transports. Photographs showed them smiling nervously on ship decks, carrying suitcases marked with chalk, the sea stretching endlessly behind them. They were the lucky ones. For every war bride, there were countless others who watched from the docks as the ships left, holding children whose fathers' names would never appear on any record. In the cities, fraternization took on a rhythm of its own. Café tables once reserved for soldiers in gray now filled with men in olive drab. Cigarettes became the coin of survival. A pack of Lucky Strikes could buy a night's meal, a pair of shoes, or a few hours of companionship. German children learned English slang faster than they learned new prayers. "Okay, buddy, Jeep." The vocabulary of occupation replaced the language of ideology. Even resentment began to sound American. But under the laughter, a quiet resentment smoldered. For many German men returning from POW camps, the sight of American soldiers walking arm in arm with German women was unbearable. Fistfights broke out in bars. Some women were shunned by their neighbors, branded as Milliebchen, Ami lovers. They were accused of betraying the nation for soap and cigarettes. Some were even attacked, their hair shorn as punishment. The war was over, but its cruelty found new shapes. Still, the power dynamic was inescapable. The Americans had everything: food, pay, freedom. The Germans had almost nothing. A single soldier's smile could mean safety. His anger, disaster. Even the kindest relationships were unequal. The line between affection and authority blurred, and both sides pretended not to notice. Yet for many women, the Americans brought something no German man could offer anymore: security. Not political, not moral, but simple. A warm meal, a promise, a night without fear. In Frankfurt, a journalist named Hilda Walter wrote a column describing this strange new world. "We are rebuilding our country," she said, "but we are also rebuilding our dignity, one gesture at a time. The Americans look at us as though we are both victims and suspects. Perhaps we are both." Her words were quietly circulated among women's groups, whispered about, then banned by Allied censors. It didn't matter. Everyone already knew it was true. The Americans, for their part, were changing too. Soldiers who had entered the war with righteous fury now found themselves teaching children, fixing roofs, organizing baseball games. Some began to see their mission not as revenge, but as responsibility. They were rebuilding the world they had helped destroy. "We are the new landlords of freedom," one captain wrote in his diary, "and we don't know how to pay the rent." Cultural exchanges bloomed in the most unexpected ways. American jazz bands played in bombed-out dance halls. German orchestras performed for GIs in converted theaters. The U.S. military sponsored film nights showing Casablanca and It's a Wonderful Life to mixed audiences. For 2 hours, everyone forgot who was the conqueror and who was the conquered. At one dance in Frankfurt, a sergeant named James held a young woman close while Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade played through crackling speakers. Around them, laughter echoed off walls still pockmarked with bullet holes. For a brief moment, the war seemed like a rumor. But outside, the world remained fractured. Black markets flourished under the very noses of the occupiers. Crime shifted from ideology to opportunity. American rations were sold illegally, German goods were smuggled across zones, and everything had a price. The moral confusion deepened. How could one preach freedom while living off control? How could one rebuild dignity while depending on the hand that conquered you? In the midst of all this, children were born, thousands of them. Some were celebrated, others hidden. Mixed-race babies, children of Black American soldiers and German women, faced discrimination from both sides. The press called them brown babies. The army called them a social problem. For their mothers, they were simply reminders that life insists on continuing, even when history disapproves. Still, not everything was sorrow. Many Americans showed genuine compassion. They organized orphanage drives, rebuilt playgrounds, and shared what they could. A sergeant from New Jersey spent his savings to build a small library for German students. A medic from Oregon worked with local doctors to reopen a hospital wing for children. These quiet acts of mercy rarely made the official reports, but they spoke louder than speeches. By the end of 1946, the transformation was complete. The occupation had become an empire of influence. America controlled Germany not through tanks, but through culture, money, and charisma. Coca-Cola, jazz, blue jeans, and baseball became symbols of modernity. The German youth copied the soldiers' slang, their hairstyles, their swagger. It was domination, but one wrapped in the scent of freedom. A German schoolteacher put it best: "They conquered us with radios, not rifles." Yet beneath that admiration was a silent question. Had they traded one master for another? As 1947 dawned, the Marshall Plan was announced. Billions of dollars would flow from the U.S. to rebuild Europe. It was a gesture of mercy, but also a claim of ownership. The war had ended with surrender. The peace continued through dependence. The Americans had not just defeated Germany, they had reinvented it in their own image. And so, the turning of the tide was not marked by battles, but by dances, marriages, and markets. The conquerors had become teachers, the defeated had become apprentices, and together they built a fragile, glittering illusion called democracy. It would last, but its foundations would always be haunted by the shadows of the ruins beneath. Empires can conquer land in a day. Trust takes a generation. By 1949, the occupation had lost its sharpness. The uniforms were still there, the checkpoints still manned, but the tension that once filled every interaction had dissolved into habit. Germany was divided now, the map itself torn into east and west, but in the American zones, the scars had begun to heal, unevenly, imperfectly, yet undeniably. Streets once lined with rubble now held bakeries again. Children played where tanks once parked, and the laughter that returned was softer, more cautious, as if the city feared it might disappear again. For the women who had lived through it all, the end of the occupation felt like stepping out of a long shadow. The same soldiers who had once arrived with rifles were now their neighbors, friends, husbands. Some had left already, returning home to small towns in Kansas, Ohio, or New York, leaving behind letters, photographs, or children whose eyes carried two countries inside them. Others stayed longer, building quiet lives amid the ruins they had helped rebuild. The irony was impossible to ignore. Germany's future now rested in the hands of those who had once destroyed it. The propaganda of 1945 had painted Americans as demons, brutes, invaders. But in 1949, that image was unrecognizable. To many Germans, they were now protectors against the Soviets, allies in a new war that wasn't fought with bombs but with ideas. The Cold War dawned like a gray sunrise, and with it came a strange reversal. The occupied became partners, and the occupiers became saviors once more. Yet beneath the polished speeches and rebuilding efforts, the memories of what had truly happened in those first post-war years lingered like smoke no wind could clear. For every story of kindness, there was another that could not be spoken aloud. Women who had survived the worst of the war found themselves silenced again, this time not by bombs or soldiers, but by shame. Relationships that had once meant survival became social poison. Neighbors whispered, churches judged, families disowned. Those who had children with Americans faced an impossible choice: keep their secret or risk exile in their own homeland. Some women hid their children's fathers' identities for decades, telling them the man had died in the war. Others clung proudly to the memory, refusing to rewrite it to make others comfortable. Sociologists studying post-war Germany decades later would call it the silent contract of survival. Everyone knew what had happened, how hunger, fear, and power had mixed to form something that wasn't quite love and wasn't quite abuse, but no one wanted to define it. Too many reputations depended on silence. The army wanted victory to remain clean. The German people wanted their suffering to remain pure. The truth sat somewhere in the middle, inconvenient and human. And yet, from that gray moral fog, something remarkable emerged. West Germany began to rebuild faster than anyone expected. Factories reopened. Schools filled. Radios played new music from America: jazz, swing, even early rock and roll. The occupying forces, once symbols of humiliation, had become the carriers of a new modernity. American food, fashion, and optimism began to replace the old militarism and despair. Coca-Cola bottles clinked on cafe tables where ration cards had once been counted. Blue jeans replaced uniforms. The young people of Germany began to dance again. Still, not everyone celebrated. Many older Germans watched the transformation with unease. They feared their culture was being erased, replaced by something glossy and foreign. "We are losing our soul," one Berlin professor wrote in 1950. "First they conquered our land. Now they conquer our imagination." He wasn't entirely wrong. American culture had arrived not as a guest, but as a landlord. But for the generation that had grown up under war and dictatorship, this new influence felt like fresh air. They didn't see conquerors, they saw the future. Liesel, now 24, worked as a translator for the American administration in Munich. She had watched her city rise from ashes, watched friends leave for the United States with the soldiers they had married. She had learned to move between two worlds: the precision of German discipline and the careless warmth of American optimism. At night, she listened to Glenn Miller on a small radio and wondered if the war had really ended, or if it had simply changed its shape. The Americans no longer carried rifles, but they still carried the power to decide what tomorrow looked like. The occupation officially ended in 1949, but the emotional occupation, the one that lived in people's memories and relationships, would last much longer. Many of the women who had once been called Ami lovers later raised children who grew up in peace, who spoke both languages, who became the bridge between two former enemies. Some of those children would become musicians, teachers, and politicians who shaped the new federal republic. Others would leave for America, chasing the dream their fathers had promised them through fading photographs. Not every story found closure. Some women who had been assaulted during the occupation never spoke of it, even to their own families. Some American veterans carried guilt they never confessed, writing it only in diaries that would be found decades later. "I don't know if we were good men," one soldier wrote in 1947. "We were just men who didn't know what good meant anymore." That sentence, written in fading ink, captured the essence of the time. Confusion masquerading as victory. The moral complexity of the occupation became a lesson history struggled to teach. The Americans had liberated Europe from tyranny, but they had also revealed the fragility of human virtue in power. Some soldiers proved that compassion could survive even after war. Others proved how easily power corrupts. The truth was neither patriotic nor shameful. It was simply human. By the 1950s, West Germany had become one of America's strongest allies. The Marshall Plan had done its work. The cities gleamed again. The scars of the war were hidden beneath concrete and commerce. Yet the personal stories, the quiet ones, never left. They lived in the space between generations, in the tension between gratitude and guilt. The women who had once feared the Americans now lived among their gifts. Refrigerators, cars, jazz records. Their children went to schools built by foreign funds. Their grandsons joined NATO armies. History had folded irony upon irony until no one could separate justice from necessity. Sometimes, in old photographs, the contradictions showed themselves plainly. A German woman smiling beside an American husband, their hands resting on a pram, the ruins of a bombed church behind them. To outsiders, it looked like hope. To those who remembered, it was more complicated. Hope, yes, but also loss, compromise, and memory. War ends on paper, one German woman said in 1951. But the heart keeps fighting for years. She had married an American engineer and moved to Illinois, where she raised 2 children who spoke English without accent. When she died, her diary was found in a trunk. The last line read, "I do not know whether I was saved or simply traded one kind of fear for another." By then, the world had moved on. Korea had become the new conflict, and Europe had become the stage for a different kind of war, a cold one, silent but constant. American soldiers remained stationed in Germany, now as allies. They walked the same streets their fathers had marched through, unaware of the stories those cobblestones held. The old insult, "mongrel Americans," was now a joke. Germany, once too proud to imagine defeat, had learned humility through hunger and recovery. And America, once certain of its moral purity, had learned that victory does not make men gods. It only makes them responsible. When historians later wrote of the occupation, they counted bridges built, economies repaired, governments established. But the true story lived in quieter places, in the trembling hands that shared bread, in the letters never sent, in the children who asked why their fathers spoke another tongue. In the end, the occupation was not about conquerors or conquered. It was about what happens when power meets need, when mercy and guilt share the same bed, and when nations learn that rebuilding a city is far easier than rebuilding trust. The same radio that once broadcast orders now played jazz and laughter. The same women who had bowed their heads in fear now walked confidently through streets filled with light. And yet, every so often, when the sirens of a passing convoy echoed through the night, they would pause, just for a moment, and remember the day the Americans first came. They had arrived as liberators, stayed as rulers, and left as teachers. And the women of Germany, who had endured all sides of humanity, carried the memory forward, not as bitterness, but as warning. Because history had taught them that every victory, no matter how righteous, leaves shadows behind. Was the American occupation a story of redemption, or a mirror of human weakness? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it always will be.